Today on Rebuilders, we are looking at power and authority and how it's shifting in society.
Yeah, so when the modes, the archetypes of authority change, the society changes. And we're seeing this. We're almost seeing, in the Trump White House, a sort of almost royal, execution of power. We're seeing that come up against leaders in other countries. But this all trickles down and it's radically changing our world. So I think it's a helpful episode.
Yeah, I agree. Let's get into it. Welcome to Rebuilders. My name is Liddy and I'm here with Mark and Daniel. How are you guys?
Good.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, wonderful.
Excellent, yeah. Hey, we've got some banter.
You've got some.
Yeah.
You brought it in
is
a
it
bag.
banter when it's more of a personal
Concern.
concern?
I call that a vendetta.
Ooh, okay. Well, all right. So we're a couple of things we're passionate about here: food and South Australia.
And by
Speak for
we, you
yourself.
mean
Speak
that
for
side of the
yourself.
room.
So there is and the reason I'm bringing this up is because I've year in, year out, particularly this time of year, the colder months, I cop collective flack from our mostly Victorian team here at Red Church.
So just to translate for our copping is receiving.
Sorry.
Yes.
Receiving negative comments from my fellow Australians from another state.
Yes.
I'm just translating
Thank
here
you.
for our foreign audience.
And it's in regards to a food. I wouldn't know. It's not an export really. It's just a food that you find in South Australia.
A dish. It's a state dish.
State
State dish.
Heritage listed dish.
Is it heritage listed?
No, he's making that up.
Okay.
No, it is in the National Trust or something.
What do they keep this
Anyway.
food
You
forever?
can't heritage list
How do you
pie
heritage
crust?
list food? Yeah, it's going to go off. I'm going to heritage list some cheese. Come back to that in 100 years.
It's earned a spot with the National Trust as a heritage icon.
My goodness.
Okay, a heritage icon.
Heritage icon. There we go. Anyway, it is it's called a pie floater. For those of you who are not familiar with the pie floater, which is probably very few of you because it's a very well-renowned dish.
All over the world there.
Yeah.
There's people there in Reykjavik and New York. Of course. Of course.
It's a bowl of pea soup, which is delicious by itself. But how can you make this dish better, you may ask? If you take a delicious meat pie, put it in hot, put some chutney or some sauce on top, and then eat that dish.
Again, we need to again think of our overseas audience because even a meat pie may be unfamiliar to many people. So we're talking a small pastry-based pie with savoury meat inside.
Yes.
And what this looks like, just imagine for those who have never seen this, imagine a sewer. And
This is the mockery I'm talking about.
In the sewer, some drunk guy's he's had a few too many beers and he's dropped his pie in the sewer. That's what it looks like.
That's extremely offensive to my people.
No, I want to try it, and I think
Yeah.
you need to cook it for us
will.
at work because we're not in South Australia. We can't. Well, we can fly there, but maybe we need to do a Rebuilders in South Australia.
Yeah.
Great idea.
There is a pub in Fitzroy that serves it.
Oh, is that
So it
part,
is an
is that-
export.
yeah, is that part of a sort of enclave of South Australians there?
campaign.
And
I have no idea.
yeah.
I mean, they
Fascinating.
actually, the pictures make it look quite appealing.
Yeah.
So I'd love to know from many of our listeners, have you come across a pie floater? Is it served in your local town, wherever that may be?
There you go.
Iceland.
big Reykjavik's massive pie floater scene.
I feel like it's just the name that really makes it sound gross.
Yeah.
You know?
Look, the origins have got to be some bloke in a kitchen dropped it in his pie. So that's got to be the origins.
Well,
Yeah.
I struggle to see anyone's
it was 1860s or something. It was a staple of the night for party or for late night revelers to help them sober up.
Well, you're just confirming my theory. Yeah. Drunk people late at night, stumbling around in the dark, dropping pies into.
No, it was a form of hospitality to help these young folk.
Well, history is written by the victors.
All right. Anyway, there's my case.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I look forward to reading the numerous emails we'll receive.
Yeah, we should have we'll do a live Adelaide Rebuilders, and the audience can throw pie floaters at.
No, I shall
at Lydia and myself. Yeah.
Yes, actually, that's okay.
Oh, that's something to look forward to. Well, speaking of history, we're currently part of it. What a weird line. Okay. Well, as a podcast, I'm just going to get us into what we're talking about today. We're always talking about culture, how it's changing and shifting. There's obviously a lot of societal change happening. Last year, I know we did a number of episodes where we talked about power and how power and authority is shifting in light of particularly the US election. And today we're going to continue a bit of that conversation.
Yeah.
So looking at who and how can exert authority, who holds power, how's that shifting?
Yeah.
All of the above.
Yeah. Well, I guess one of the sort of background thoughts that are going to help us analyze what's going on in the world is the idea that there's authority. We can all recognize people who have authority, from the police officer to the royal to the prime minister to the head of a corporation. But often too, it's not just the exercise of power, it's how power is exercised. So there's different modes of authority, archetypes of authority, you could argue. Famously, at the beginning of the 20th century, Max Weber, the famous German sociologist, talked about different modes of authority, and he named several of these. So he said that there is a kind of authority, and I think we've spoken about this before on here, so we're going to use this again as a lens today, but there's the authority of inherited power. Charles III is King of England because he is the son of Elizabeth II, and he inherited his authority. And then there's a line of inheritance where that'll be passed on down the chain. So, William will be next. So that has been throughout history. Often authority will be passed through tribal groups, kinship groups, nations where there was a direct line of lineage. In other countries, there was harems where there'd almost be a competition where a monarch might have various wives, and there was sort of a bit of a battle royale over who shall carry the line onwards. But the overarching idea was that this line was inherited.
Yeah.
Sometimes that was there was adoption. We saw that with the Caesars. There'd be an adoptive element so that someone could be Caesar, but it still contained the idea that it went down a line of inheritance. You also had another type of power that Weber spoke about, which was charismatic power. This was the kind of power that emerges from someone's attractiveness, force of their personality. This could be someone who's just incredibly socially gregarious and connective that people are drawn to in a workplace, who then gain some sense of power. But also this can be the leader who connects with the emotions of a people, who the force of the way that they carry themselves, they almost becoming a living symbol. And we think about, figures, particularly in the 1930s, of dictators Mussolini, Hitler, sort of negative versions of this. You'd also see other versions of this in contemporary ideas of celebrity. Elvis Presley, could be this, or the Beatles or something. Marilyn Monroe, where there's something about the attractiveness of this person draws people in, and they have a sense of power, which could be linked to their intelligence or their physical attractiveness or whatever. And then he talked about a third sense of power, which is we call a very boring title, but rational legal. And it is somewhat boring. It's about legal institutions and frameworks which then confer power on someone. So to give you an example of that, our Prime Minister here in Australia is Anthony Albanese, who was elected after a federal election. Yep. And the laws of the Constitution of Australia say, basically, and our legal framework point to him being Prime Minister because he won the election. He's the head of the Labor Party who won the election, got the most seats in Parliament. Now, there's also a way in which he can lose his authority is if the Governor General removes his power. So many other countries have their own versions of this. But just to recap, power that you inherit through often family lines, power that exudes from you, from a form of charisma, personal power, and then rational legal, which comes from a legal framework.
Yep.
And just to sort of look at these in the recent past, which sets us up for how we're about to talk about it today, very much, let's go back to the end of World War II, and the world had been fundamentally traumatized by a global war. And when they sort of did the analysis of this, it very much felt like, what had led to that was cults of personality around charismatic leaders. That could be, Adolf Hitler, who did sort of get in through electoral means, but then very much became a sort of dictator through the force of his personality, trying to connect with these kinds of power issues connected to, ethnic race, land, soil, a sense of being German, which went beyond his country. As the Anschluss, the Austria joined Germany because of this greater sense of being German. So, Mussolini, Stalin would be argued by many communists to have taken over the sort of, framework of communism through his own force of personality. So what they saw is the world was torn apart by this. So then very much what you see into the post-war era is the rise and dominance of the rational legal framework. It moves away from personal power and individuals, charismatic individuals, to more things like the United Nations, cooperative bodies, not based around one person, but legal frameworks. The European Economic Community, which becomes the EU, grows up in the wake of this. ASEAN, all over the world, these different sort of like cooperative organizations. And you see a move away from charismatic types of leadership to a much more, legal framework. And the rational legal sort of leader par excellence is almost more of a cool, calm, collected manager.
Sure.
They're not as much leading as they're managing their societies. Now, inherited power, for some time, you could go back, had actually been restricted. So, look, in Britain, very much had Parliament restricting the power of the monarch. So there was sort of this bargain done. So there was still inherited power out there. But if you look at a lot of the royal families, you could look at the Netherlands or Scandinavian countries, UK, the royal family's still there, but they have much reduced their power. So the dominant one was the sort of managerial, sort of rational legal framework, and that's really what has dominated. Now, just to add something as well, part of what we've been talking about in sort of our exploration additionally of secularism is very much that world is the world in which secularism really took hold. It deliberately moved away from emotions, the irrational, other sorts of meanings like nationhood or religion or royalty, which could sort of, in a sense, tap into something which people saw as dangerous emotions. So very much was sort of like, let's have a cool, calm, collected view of politics. Let's not try and go too big here and look for meanings beyond just things like the economy or good policy.
Yeah.
And so that was fertile ground there for a sort of kind of life to grow up. Joseph Minich in his book, Bulwarks of Unbelief, he sort of locates the real rise where secularism really takes off, even though the idea had been around for some time, in the 1960s in Western countries, because that's when you sort of see this middle class move into this world where in the sort of peace and prosperity that followed the war, this rational legal framework, this cool, calm, collected mode of doing leadership, which then trickled down into the society, you could have the impression to live without God.
Okay. I have a lot of questions for that, but I'm going to hold them for now. How have these played out in the recent past?
So this, in the recent past, starts to come undone. And what you see is there is this sort of backsliding a little bit. Robert Nisbet wrote a book in 1976, and he talked about that, his argument was the founding fathers of the United States, having rejected the British royal system, of course, for those who perhaps don't know the history, the US was originally a colony. There were colonies of the United States.
Yep.
So they were part of Britain, technically, legally, framework, and under the royal, authority. But then obviously with the War of Independence, they break away from that. And the Founding Fathers try and set up more of a republican idea, looking back to ancient Greece, ancient Rome, where there's limits on the power that their alternative to the king, which is the president, will have. So there's checks and balances on the executive branch. But Nisbet, again, writing at the beginning of the 70s, noted that there'd been some sort of backsliding. He would go back to FDR, but he also noticed that in the Kennedy White House, all of a sudden royal language started to get used. John F. Kennedy was spoken about, his White House was described as Camelot. People began to refer to his charismatic power, his attractiveness as an individual, the sort of attractiveness of his wife, Jackie Kennedy, and even the sort of advisors around him all of a sudden began to be spoken of in the way of like courtiers in medieval past of royal kings. And then also there's that sort of often the sort of the mythological dynamic of the killed or wounded king is a deep part of sort of Western mythology. And obviously his assassination plays into that. And this sort of the mystery of Camelot is only reinforced by his assassination. And you see this continue. Ronald Reagan, as a former Hollywood actor, brought a kind of celebrity into the White House that had been developing that more charismatic power in Hollywood. The advent of rock and roll, sort of creates that in popular music. But we then see it increasingly move into the realm of politics. And Nisbet sort of warned that, you could see in the United States a sort of expanding of the executive branch where it executive power began to move almost more into a more royalist sort of mode. And under the Bush administration, interestingly, in reaction to, or some people argue it was sort of being planned before, in reaction to the events of 9/11 and then the global war on terror, there's a reimagining that begins to happen in the legal framework. Starts in the legal framework, and I think it was a guy, John Yoo, was a sort of lawyer to Dick Cheney, who was the vice president, Donald Rumsfeld, where it was an imagining of the presidency with a much greater scope and range of power. And the justification for this was that there was a new age of terror where, in a sense, America was protected by its oceans and relatively benign neighbors. But now the insidiousness of terrorism, which can happen anywhere, and it's struck at, the centers of power of economic power in New York and political power in Washington, was that there needed to be the president needed to be, in a sense, let loose from some of those restraints of legal power so that they can prosecute terrorism to protect people.
Yeah.
So you see these sort of, this sort of like backsliding, if you like, perhaps from that original vision, or that's how Nisbet would argue that. You also see this change that I think happens from the internet. If you look at the rise of the internet, it creates a new way to question the power or the legal framework. So again, what solidified the authorities of the managerial, legal, rational mode of authority was that they were the experts. We'll be in power because we have the ideas of how to run the economy efficiently. We can run the power grid efficiently. We can do things, and also we can control, in an age of mass media, broadcast media, the story.
Yes.
All of a sudden, the internet creates a way of telling alternate stories, of questioning dominant authorities, and also a sort of forensic uncovering of some of the injustices, which formerly people like investigative reporters at a high-level newspaper could do. Have Seymour Hersh uncovering the My Lai massacre at the New York Times. So that stuff did happen, but then it sort of goes en masse. But there's also no sort of framework necessarily to test what is right or wrong. And a sort of kind of mob mentality happens online, digital swarms, which actually the legal rational framework had been set up to stop that.
Yes.
So the idea was the legal rational framework was cool, calm, collected. It was rational. Whereas what we see online, because online you can pursue whatever interests you want, and you see online instantly as it kicks off things like pornography, gambling, the sort of darker sides of human nature are exemplified online. So you start to see the return of something which really we hadn't seen since the 19th century, this sort of mob mentality and cancel culture and all of this. So all of a sudden, the managerial class of the legal rational framework came under pressure.
Yeah.
And then you see the rise of populism. As the world gets more complex, the managerial class of the legal rational mode of authority find it harder to run everything. More chaos is terrorism, climate change, all these things to run these things, the global financial crisis, and they start to lose legitimacy. So what we've seen is this change happening in the background.
Okay, so how is it playing out now?
Okay, so, we have seen as things get more complex, there is this greater temptation to exercise more power. The internet has sped things up. Hamas Rosa speaks of a sort of culture of acceleration. We want more things, we want them more quickly. And there's just an inner dynamic that the more that we economically develop, the more that we become complex as a society, the faster things go. Mm-hmm. And again, with online, whereas in the past, if you were, if you had to pay your power bill, you'd have to write a check and get an envelope and walk down to the post box and put it in or something like this, or go to the power company and pay it. Whereas now in the background, you can just you come out of your bank, you don't even think about it. So there's this high speed dynamic which has put tremendous pressure on checks and balances in legal frameworks. So that has continued. And what you've seen is there's almost in certain places this sort of bottleneck where, hey, there's a housing crisis. We want this to change. In past, we would have left that to the sort of experts to work through, but the sort of voices of discontent can get louder and louder online with the way of doing this, and it eats at power. So what it does is we're seeing this paradox that many leaders find themselves in, where the crises are growing, the ability for people to complain about the crisis and even protest about the crisis is growing. We saw this shift from the online mob to very fast moving. It was almost like the online mobs to flash mobs doing some silly dance somewhere to protests happening real quick and getting out of control. So there is this sort of new dynamic where in response, leaders then either sit back, trust the process or of the legal framework, or exercise more power.
What I'm forming a question here.
Yeah.
And even you were talking about how it's played out in the recent past and how it's playing out now. Would you say that there's a extent to which humanity are more likely to revert to emotional reactions and personal wants and needs over going along the lines of a legal rational kind of framework? Is that's just kind of how humanity operates?
Yes. So there's a really interesting book. I think it's called Liberalism as a Way of Life by Lefebvre. I think that's how you say the name. He's a professor at, I think, the University of New South Wales in Sydney. And he makes the argument, this really interesting argument, that liberal democratic society, which is the rational legal society that emerges in the second half of the 20th century in its full force, that is predicated on a certain kind of citizen who is rational. So if you've got cool, calm, collected leaders, you need cool, calm, collected citizens who have patience, who want to pursue universally agreed upon sense of justice, who are not going to jump into that conspiracy theory. They're going to trust the experts. So there's trust. There is, and then you'd have people like Tom Holland in his book Dominion and others. John Gray would argue this, the philosopher, that liberal democratic society is actually based upon a lot of Christian values. So John Gray would argue, the philosopher, that liberalism is in trouble because secularism has so almost like liberal democracy is based upon Christian values, but then liberal democracy creates a form of secularism which undermines the very values upon which it sits. Mm-hmm. So, what Lefebvre is arguing in his book is, and it's fascinating, he basically says, so there's the argument in Christianity that there was a period of Christendom. Often people will locate that at the beginning of Constantine, who was the Roman Empire, who makes the Roman Empire Christian effectively. And then what that meant was all of a sudden you could be a cultural Christian. Before then, if there was persecution, you're not going to be a cultural Christian because there's no cultural value in becoming a Christian. Mm-hmm. You have to really believe it. But then all of a sudden, once it becomes culturally acceptable and even culturally rewarding to become a Christian, you create this sort of bifurcation, division between what I proclaim publicly and then my own private life. So I'm a Christian in public, but then in my private life, I don't really live it. Now, he argues so there's a differentiation there between Christendom and Christianity.
Sure.
Now, and Kierkegaard and Jacques Ellul and many people wrote about this. But then he argues that we're now at that way with liberal democratic society. So he differentiates between liberaldom and liberalism. Mm-hmm. So he would say that you have societies where we proclaim we're a liberal democracy, but individual citizens are not acting in calm ways. They're not acting in rational ways. They don't necessarily believe the experts. They're filled with their own passion, desires. They're competitive. They want to have their own version of justice versus a universal sense of justice. They want to keep it within their kinship groups or their, and so like when you had very homogenous societies as well, in a sense, you could have sort of agreed upon norms. You look at Japan, which is a very homogenous society, which is now facing sort of challenges as, it needs migration and other groups to come in because it's got a negative birth rate. So once you then have subcultures and a more diverse society, you won't have some of those universally agreed upon forms of justice are not universally agreed upon.
Yes.
So how do you do that in a multicultural, multi-faith, multi-ethic, environment? So I think the reality is that at the end of the book, he literally has spiritual practices for unbelieving liberals.
Oh, wow.
So it literally ends up like some sort of version of some spiritual formation book, but it's like liberal formation. Because if liberal society is going to survive, well, you need to do these practices. And it's hilarious. They're all Christian. Be more gracious, be more just and merciful. Don't let your desires run free. I'm reading this going, this is unbelievable.
Yeah.
So I think you're right. And I think the mistake that liberal democratic societies did is at the beginning, I think the origins of it was built upon a Christian understanding of that there are different values that a Christian, Christianity will be feeding them. So therefore you could have this public system, which was originally really imagined in reaction to a lot of the wars of religion where we don't want Catholics and Protestants fighting each other. So we won't bring that into the public sphere as much, but we'll still have sort of basic Christian values underneath, And you look at mid-century when C.S. Lewis is on the BBC or wherever he was publicly talking about mere Christianity. So it was a mere Christianity that Orthodox Christians, different Protestants, Catholics could all agree on. So at the end of the day, I think a question comes back to really is sin is still present and liberal democratic society is not able to change the human heart.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to boil it down.
That was a small speech as an answer, and we landed at...
No, it's good, it's good. Okay, well, let's move to an example of how it's playing out now.
Yes.
Trump and his charismatic power.
Yes. So Trump is a classic example of charismatic power returning. So if you look at the drama, and we won't get stuck in too many of the individual examples of this because they are legion. The override, Trump comes in term one and very much doesn't control all of the different institutions of American power. So he comes in and almost comes in with a bit more of a framework of the sort of conservative libertarian, I'm just going to come in and make everything great. We're going to go back to what America was.
Yes.
I don't know when, 1962 or something, who knows when, but some golden past. But obviously straight away, even within his cabinet, there is a constant legal framework and even individuals. There was that, I don't know who, I can't remember. There was a famous, it was like a famous, I forgot what they call themselves, but they were a famous sort of person who wrote an article, it was maybe to the New York Times or something like, we're part of the Trump administration and we are resisting him from within, or I am resisting him. And there's all this speculation. Who is it? And basically this anonymous individual we're doing this and we're ensuring that he doesn't go beyond the legal rational framework.
Yeah.
So there was this constant legal rational framework that leads to all the different cases when he loses office, and even around the legal ramifications of the disputed election. Now, if you look at this from the 20,000-foot view and you get out of the weeds of all the different examples, it is a battle between charismatic power and legal restraints on that power. So there's this overarching belief in Trump as a charismatic figure that America's broken, I got to get it back to the golden age. And the thing that's stopping me is too much bureaucracy, too much legal framework or whatever. Essentially, I think that you could boil it down to that argument. Comes out of office, that just continues, that court cases, multiple court cases over all different things. To everyone's surprise, he comes back in because part of that story as well, the story here isn't just Trump's charismatic power. The story is of then with the Biden administration, America trying to bring back the rational legalist sort of mode, but the utter struggling of that in the face of the significant structural systemic issues that the managerial rational legal framework has allowed to happen. So managers often manage what is, they build upon what has been founded, and they're not always great out on making the strong leadership decisions that need to be made for renewal or the aversion of crises.
Yes, okay.
So often it's the sort of almost like, and there's different arguments that could be made that it's almost like bureaucracies, legal frameworks operate as a form of AI. It becomes autonomous. So you got someone like, let's take this to Britain when Boris Johnson comes in, with a very similar sort of mandate to make Britain great again. He didn't say that, but, a very similar thing. Another charismatic personality, Boris Johnson. Dominic Cummings, who is sort of, brains, chief of staff, whatever, he, argues that the whole of their project was stopped because there was the British Civil Service and Whitehall operates almost as an autonomous AI, and the legal rational framework stops. So he talks about, he'd come and say, we're going to do this, and the system would stop it. It's the restraints on power. And his argument is that doesn't enable us to change the big things that's going to bankrupt Britain unless we can go forward. So what happens is Trump's second term comes in a completely different way. So this isn't just the charismatic style, it's also a taking over of various institutions that would provide a rationalist legal framework against Trump's authority. Whereas in Britain, Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson give up, and the Conservative Party is in sort of disarray, and there's a new party under Farage, Reform, which is very popular in polling at the moment. They sort of give up, and Dominic Cummings is going around giving interviews. Trump, and sort of the project is we're going to take all of the different things, the different levers and institutions, and insert into all of them. So what you sort of see is, Pete Hegseth, with defence, you see RFK with health. They're all mini versions of charismatic authorities. Many of them are not got people who had, like Keir Starmer, the current Prime Minister of England, is a classic example of the rational legal framework. He comes from law, civil servant from law, a prosecutor, public prosecutor. So whereas RFK is, part of the Kennedys, he's doing all different kinds of things. He was a lawyer, public figure, Hegseth, news person, Tulsi Gabbard. All these people are personalities, charismatic personalities. But then what you see is this is what Nisbet's fear was, a return very much of a sort of royalist view. So I mentioned John Woo's the Hong Kong film director, John Yoo, who talked about, this expanding the idea of what the power of the presidency could be. Even he's sort of saying Trump's gone beyond anything he was hoping for and moved into dangerous territory. So what you now see is this complete different vision to the conservative American ideal, which was small government, states' rights, government just as a basic functionary to enable the country to work and do some basic stuff like defense or whatever, to this massive, almost royal reimagining of executive power. And this is played out on won't go through all the details. This is Trump doing tariffs. This is Trump doing the takeover of DC and possibly other cities and putting troops on ground to change it. So it's almost like what's happened is, he's stepped into that royal mode. And we even see this aesthetically. The White House looks more Baroque or Rococo or more Louis the Sun King. There's plans for the grand gold-laced ballroom, which will radically change the White House. The White House, when I first rocked up to the White House, when I first saw it, I don't know how old I was, I was shocked how small it was. And there's a little bit of a design to, there's something that's meant to be a little bit humble to, like not be a royal palace per se. There's many countries whose royal palaces are far grander than the White House, but this will turn it into a more palatial thing. So there's almost this cultural thing happening here with this reimagination of power. And it's hugely consequential. So I talked about this in terms of this presidency when we did our election thing. I said, this will be one of the most consequential presidencies. This very well now, possibly since sort of FDR, centralization of power to get America through the Great Depression, this is possibly the most consequential, and we're only, 9 months in.
Yeah.
So in terms of military power, even, as we go to air, there's talk of him sacking a central bank governor, Federal Reserve governor. So interference in anything which holds back the charismatic leader. And this is a massive example of that sort of royal power, that Nisbet. Now, what's interesting is we don't see this in the same way in the rest of, particularly the Anglosphere or a lot of Western European and even Southern European countries. This is more akin to what you would see in Erdogan in Turkey, Putin, in style. I'm not saying all of the elements, but in style, it's more looks like that than it does what you're seeing in Germany or Portugal or wherever.
So the managerial power is very much under pressure.
Yes, hugely under pressure. So, Keir Starmer came back from holidays last week or something, and there was an article in the Times basically saying, he's returning to a country in crisis. You have huge sort of discontent around the government's, bringing it. I won't go into the details, but long story, multiple migrants brought in. The government made this mistake where someone emailed someone around, emailed the Taliban, I think was basically the story. I may not be getting it exactly right, and revealed all these people who were working with the coalition forces in Afghanistan, which put all those lives in danger. So behind closed doors, they'd been, bringing people into the UK. So huge, as we've talked about before here, huge tensions around migration in Europe, and huge financial problems. But there was this amazing photo where you had Trump in the White House and he was sitting at his desk, and behind his desk, sort of almost like kids coming into the school principal for a telling off, was all the leaders of the sort of, European leaders and von der Leyen and, Maloney and, Starmer, all I think Starmer was there, all these people. And it was just, for me, encapsulated this confrontation between the royal power, the charismatic power of Trump, and this sort of rational legal bureaucracy.
Yes.
So, for example, we see this around Ukraine war. There's an element where Trump is now advancing a kind of attempt to use almost the force of his will and friendships and almost connection with Kim Jong-un or Putin to sort of end the Ukraine war, struggling with that, similar with Gaza. Actually, Netanyahu, in some ways, there's a very similar story here between the legal, in the Israeli judicial system versus Netanyahu, which, very much led up to everything that's happened since October the 7th. So the manager power is now under tremendous pressure for two reasons, really. The rise of the internet, or three reasons. The rise of the internet, and I'll link that, point A and B, to increasing crises and difficulty of managing incredibly complex societies with increased global crises. That's one, A and B.
Yeah.
Two, you now have the global superpower who was formerly part of the Western alliance, tied to Britain, tied to Europe, ally of Australia, ally of Japan, South Korea, now operating not so much in the rational legal framework.
Yes.
So, it just was a EU free trade deal done, or not free trade deal, new trade deal done. And all of a sudden, so all these negotiations, and then Trump in the last 24 hours or something is talking about more tariffs on. There is currently, you cannot send from Australia a package to the US anymore. Through Australia Post. Same in many European countries, because the tariffs have just thrown everything into chaos. So all of these things that we just took for granted. So there is now a disruptor, and it's the big boy in the room. The US is now not playing by the rules, and that creates a crisis for all of the other managerial, rational, legal leaders of the West.
Yes. So moving on to a final point.
Yeah.
The power arms race.
Can I just go back to one point I didn't make? Sorry.
No.
One other fascinating dynamic, which you see as part of this sort of almost royalist power, which again too is shocking when you study American conservatism for the last 50 years. American conservatism, is government get out of business, let the market be free. That's the whole sucker right there.
Yeah.
Trump just purchased a significant stake of Intel, the processor thing. Why? Because there's a geopolitical power struggle with China. And so basically you have state ownership of American corporations. This is something that really only happens has been disparaged by the American right as something communist countries do. And then I think it was the White House said, or there's leaks within the White House, or people saying the White House, they're going to buy more companies. So this is fascinating, because this is the kind of mode. Everyone thought that China was going to look like America. China has state-owned entities, SOEs, so they're companies that China owns. America's now doing what China's done, a country that's pursuing capitalism but with significant government control.
Yeah.
If you said that to someone, if you'd rocked up to a Republican Party 6 years ago, say maybe before Trump won, even in Trump won, you said, we're going to have state-owned entities. We're going to have tariffs. We're going to have this example of Washington's power. People would have had heart attacks. So this just shows you the tremendous way, going back to my original point, change the mode of authority, you radically change the culture.
Fascinating. Circle back to the final point. Yep.
Oh, yes. So sorry, I think we've got really, we have this power, there's now an arms race between Trump's escalation of use of power. Now, again, too, if you think about this right, the charismatic royalist type power wants to keep pushing its power. Its thing is power.
Yes.
The rationalist legal framework is publicly against using power, although it does use legal, rational means to control. So what you're seeing is, on one sense, Trump will send troops onto the streets of Washington. And you can make the argument that's also because of mismanagement and failed democratic policies and so on. I think you've got to see the whole thing as an entity. Both influences are part of this. But then, say, in the United Kingdom, you're also seeing the increase of speech, freedom, issues around online speech, public protest, and so on. So in a sense, you're seeing both the royal charismatic power increase, but also the state, the managerial rational legal framework through legislation, like in Australia, not having the internet for under 16s for certain social media things or whatever. So you're seeing the rational legal people who are sort of almost their whole thing is not being too powerful, having to employ power, but they're almost doing it in more of a, not passive aggressive is the wrong term, but sort of in the sense of doing it through increased legal means. Just one example of this is as technology takes off and surveillance is everywhere, that's meant to get rid of crime. But then you're seeing the rise of, we just had protests in Melbourne where you're seeing sort of Antifa type people with masks on. You're seeing people break into houses because car technology is now better. It's hard to hotwire a car. So they go into the house with a mask on and steal the keys. Yeah. So this weird thing is that as the more legal sort of definitions of power increase, it creates its own reaction. So we're in this sort of like standoff, but it's also like an arms race. And the overarching big story is an escalation of power on both sides.
So you've been outlining how modes of authorities, as they change, modes of authority changes, society changes.
Yes.
And we have listeners across the world in a bunch of different contexts. how do we best understand this and how do we best prepare for the change that is already coming?
So I think there'll be inevitably a trickle down with this. We've been in a few year season where you've seen this, particularly in corporate culture, Christian culture, a calling out of toxic leadership, toxic behaviors, abuse, bullying, movements like Me Too and so on. And what a lot of that's done has introduced greater levels of processes and procedures, which is to stamp out that sort of authority and leadership.
So that's that rational legal approach. Yeah.
That's been continued. But what you're seeing is outside of this, there's an increasing frustration or realization or idea that actually what is holding us back from the sort of malaise that the West finds itself and much of the world finds itself in lots of places, it's actually bureaucracy and these procedures holding us back. So, in Australia, there's a conversation like many countries around housing. We just had a meeting in Canberra around everyone wants to build more houses. We want house prices to go down and we want people to have houses. How do we do this? And the overarching thing is all sides of politics and the experts are saying it's too much bureaucracy. So I think for people who have been shaped by this era of where anti-toxic leadership now, power is bad, we could have this sort of neck-breaking moment where all of a sudden you see a trickle down and then people just start pursuing that form of leadership again, younger generations or whatever. I actually think that is happening a little bit with younger generations. So that's one part of it. But I think the other part I really want to sort of pull out, and this links into the episode that we did, I think 2 episodes on about the sort of emergence of a post-secular society is as I said, the legal rational framework, the managerial framework was great soil for secularism. It was built upon these sort of assumed Christian influence, Christian infused society where some of the Christian values were still present, even if people perhaps stopped going to church. But as that is increasingly secularized, that sort of undermine the society. And so people are looking for bigger stories. They're looking beyond that framework because they feel its plausibility structures are weakened.
Sure.
It's not delivering the life that they want. It's not living up to its promises. So the return of a sort of royal sensibility, particularly in the Trump White House, is utterly fascinating from a spiritual perspective. The idea of where authority comes from in the legal rational mode is it comes from a set of institutions and it comes from democratic processes. So Anthony Albanese is the Prime Minister of Australia because we believe that he was elected and reflects the general will of the Australian people. So his authority comes from the Vox Populi, the voice of the people.
Yep.
Right? Now, a royal authority doesn't come from the voice of the people. A royal authority, if you trace all of them back, it could be the British royal family, which, Charles, which is rooted in a Christian vision. When you trace it back to its origins, just have to watch Charles's coronation to see that, head of the Anglican Church and so on. It is a divinely chosen monarch, is the idea. Japanese emperor, son of heaven. You see this across royal families across the world. So what royal power is ultimately its authority is a form of sacred power. For many years, it was believed that the royals could heal people. The British royal family could heal people by touching them because they had this they were conduit of this power. You see, this in ideas in many different countries. So the return of a sort of Trumpian, charismatic royal power is actually a sign of us moving into a post-secular state, a post-secular era, a post-secular mood. You see people looking to things like the growth of kinship again. So again, looking at the American, legal democratic thing was that there were societies that were mired in corruption and criminality because of kinship ties. Sicily was often picked on because it's the home of, La Cosa Nostra, the mafia, because, and sociologists would say, it's because of all these kinship ties, vendettas against other people, because my family versus yours, this tribal dynamic. In, Iraq, that the blame for the Iraqi government not succeeding as the US wanted to after the, Saddam Hussein was deposed, there was too much tribal dynamics, right? So liberal democratic societies try to knock down those sort of tribal, ethnic, national things. But you're seeing this return of things like Christian nationalism, ethnic nationalism. Nationalism is an attempt to find meaning not in the will of the people per se, but actually in blood and soil, in an ethnic group's blood, in that particular part of the soil that these people own. So what you're beginning to see is in politics it's just the beginning of a kind of post-secular dynamic starting to reemerge. Mm-hmm. It's been fascinating watching, I don't know if you've seen it, but Gavin Newsom, who is the governor of California, has just gone crazy on social media
tweets.
And he's basically sort of doing a parody mock of Trump, but talking as Trump does in caps and memes and stuff like this. But what you see is it's almost also like, oh, you're going to fight dirty, we're going to fight dirty. And so you see this sort of like, once you get into the sort of battle with this form of power, it's almost like, trying to fight a pig in mud, you'll never get dirty yourself. So, I think that what we're seeing is we're going to see a few things. Now, Australia, I still think, is pushing into the managerial. Anthony Albanese won because we're looking at the rest of the world going, we don't want to, and the Labor Party is still hugely popular here. Latest polling I just saw today across the nation. We're like, we want to keep going with our rational legal framework. We want to have a manager. We don't want to do what everyone else is doing. So there's still going to be outposts of this.
Sure.
And perhaps that's because we've had less crises than some of the other countries. There's problems, but not to the level of crises. But how will this affect other nations? And one thing you're seeing is the growth of military power. The growth of military power, the state's sort of monopoly on violence, you're seeing in response to the authoritarian power of kingly power of Vladimir Putin taking over Ukraine. Europe's having to rearm. There's conscription happening. I was in Norway, and there's people at the bunch of young women at the airport sitting next to me who conscripted or whatever, and they're on the border up north. So you see this dynamic that's going to change. That's going to change the culture. So I think the big story here is the gap between liberaldom and liberalism. Mm-hmm. The crisis is now not so much with the church and the gap between what is said and what's believed. In some places it still is. In the US there's still those elements. But I think what we're seeing is an increased post-secular tone to our politics. How does it all end? I have no idea. Mm-hmm. But it's a sign. It's a further sign of the weakening of secularism. And in the midst of that, again, just the reminder that on the ground level, people are looking for stories beyond the secular.
Yeah.
People's trust in these institutions has gone. This is an incredible moment I think there's an opening here. People are looking beyond politics and the order of what has been to deliver good things. And two things. We need the church to step into that in ministering to people, but also going back to, I think some of those values that when there are people who are shaped by the fruits of the Spirit, the Sermon on the Mount in society, that has a transformative effect on that society and moves it to health. So, let's not give up on that. Yeah.
That's good. Any final comments from anyone?
I've had a few comments.
Yes.
I've been reflecting recently. I think this confirms it more and more. Just the different stories that we are shaped by and how we see the world by. And I think what you're outlining for us is, kind of that liberal democratic story that and I'm sure many of our listeners will know and resonate, and that's how we kind of have grown up and understand many of the things. And just the ongoing invitation that we, as followers of Jesus, that we are invited into a different story, his kingdom. And so how do we, despite the enemy's continued efforts to keep people wrapped up in another story, how do we live into that kingdom story? And I'm just realizing more and more the invitation for faith is to place our hope, our perspective, align our decisions, our will into that story where the creator of it all lives and rules. And so I just want to encourage our listeners into aligning with that story, but helping people who still understand and know, see the world through this other one.
And that story is rooted in Jesus, whose mode of authority is completely transformative and splits history into two eras and has changed the world.
Yeah.
And I think, bringing people back to that mode of authority, king, prophet, priest, all in one person, I think that's also part of this, the answer here.
Yeah. A great way to end the episode. Thank you so much for joining us. If you would like a list of some of the resources that we mentioned during this episode, you can subscribe to our mailing list by heading to rebuilders.co, and we'll send out an email in a few days' time. Thanks for joining us.